Going to be a interesting presentation for a lot of reasons, and there's a lot to show. So I'll just start off by saying, please don't try to read everything on screen. I'll refer to everything as much as possible and try and give you some interesting tidbits. Use the highlighter to do that. I'm referring to this as the trials of Yda Addis. And what I mean by that is not just courtroom trials, but life trials, things that happen to people. And sometimes they come in bunches all at one time. And for Yda, she had different periods of time where those trials were most acute. And we're also looking at gender in what we can call the court of public perception. So it's not just what happens in the courtroom, it's also what happens in the media. And as a lot of us know, we often hear about how the media tries to influence what happens in the legal system. And at different times, it can be more obvious than others. So some things to think about as we go through today's presentation is about how her perception, because as you'll find out, the gentleman involved here, and on the screen, we've got former Governor John Downey here on the top right, longtime resident of Los Angeles. And down on the bottom left, we've got Charles Storke, who was a member of the Santa Barbara elite. These guys don't get talked about in terms of how they dressed or how they looked in court, if they were even there. But the attention was really on Yda. And so a lot of that's about how women are perceived in the court and also in the media. So we'll launch right in. And again, like I just said, if you have questions, she'll jump in at any time and I'll be happy to stop and answer those if I can as we go along. So again, there's legal trials, personal trials, and media ones here. And a lot of these newspaper articles we'll be looking at today are about her troubles, about mystery, about the way she dressed, being under close surveillance. And there are reasons why that may have happened. Some may have been legitimate, others may be questionable, as we'll talk about as we go through. A lot of this is stuff you may not see as much today, more of that time period, but there may be some similarities to what happens today as well. It's pretty obvious once we get through this presentation that Yda Addis lived a very unconventional life for a late 19th century Victorian era woman. She was a writer, she was a poet, she was a journalist, she was a historian. She had a lot of different activities she was involved in a fairly short time in the last couple decades of the 19th century. And so most women obviously were expected to marry very early, have children, raise their families, support their husband. That was not Yda. And we'll talk about how that could manifest into her trials and troubles. She was born in what was called at the time Bleeding, Kansas. And this is in the 1850s because Kansas was a flashpoint of violence between abolitionists and pro-slavery forces. This is a big part of the years running up to the Civil War. Her parents, Alfred, Shea Addis, who was from Pennsylvania, and her mother, Yda Hillis Short, who was born in Indiana, were married in Kansas. They were married in Lawrence in 1856. Just as all this is going on, the Bleeding Kansas, the violence, and what have you. So on the top left here, we have the marriage listing in the newspaper. On the bottom right is the census from 3 years later. Alfred Addis, artist, which meant he was a photographer actually, Sarah, and at the time their only child, Yda, sometimes spelled I-D-A, more often Y-D-A, but still pronounced the same way. Alfred had his own unconventional life, and sometimes these things obviously pass down through family members. As I said, he was from Pennsylvania. He drifted west. It has been said he was in Kansas in the early 1850s. The earliest I could find was this newspaper article from May 1855 in Lawrence, Kansas. Fashionable tailoring, so that appears to have been his profession. He was probably apprenticed or taught to do that as a young man. And that's what he started off doing. But when he met his future wife's father, Thomas Short, who was a photographer in Lawrence, Alfred decided to join him in that occupation. So here's an advertisement from a little bit later when the Addises had to move from Lawrence to Leavenworth, Fort Leavenworth, in the Leavenworth Federal Prison. That's what that place is known for. They moved there because of the violence going on. Evidently, Alfred Addis was pro-slavery in his sentiments, and abolitionists were going after people like that. So he was forced to move to Leavenworth, where it was safer for people of his point of view. He did serve briefly in the House of Representatives for Kansas. This is a short article that talks about his leaving or vacating his office So he wasn't there very long, but he tried to get very involved in what was happening in Kansas society, at least that part of Kansas along the border of Missouri, not too far from Kansas City.
We have a question, Paul.
Sure, go ahead.
It might be answered later, but Sunny asks, did Yda's family try to look for Yda? They read some articles, but they couldn't find it.
Yeah, let's hold on with that to the very end, and I'll try to give you my best impressions of what happened to her with that. All right, other ways we try to find information. This is a city directory from, I think, 1863. So here's Alfred with this photograph, and ambrotype, just another version of a photograph, and his gallery. But he also operated a theater called the Union Theater in Leavenworth. So he was trying to branch out and do different things, doing photography at the same time as running the theater. As was the case throughout the country, photographers, it was a hard business to be in. It wasn't that much business going on, so especially in small towns, so you have to diversify and try other things. Now, what Alfred did is he left his first wife, Sarah, and his children. There were a couple other children other than Yda by that point, and he winds up in Cincinnati in 1866. What had happened was the theater burned down, and it's not clear whether that was maybe abolitionists tracking him down as a pro-slavery person, or whether it was an accident. Wood frame buildings, oil lamps, those were common occurrences. Fires broke out all the time. But he wound up leaving. And this is a German language newspaper in the Cincinnati area in 1866. And way at the bottom it shows Alfred Addis marrying a woman named Ellen Wallace. That marriage did not last long. Within a few years, he left her. So on the right is a record of divorce for Alfred leaving his wife, who was known as Nellie. He abandoned her, and she probably had to wait a period of time. A lot of states had laws where you had to wait a couple of years to get a divorce because of abandonment. So that was finalized in 1872, by which time he had returned to his first wife. So in 1868, March 30th, Alfred Addis remarries Yda Hillis Addis. Now, if you're wondering why he could remarry somebody before he had his second divorce, that's a good question. We don't even know if he had a first divorce from Sarah. So I won't try to get you too confused with the marriage situation, but let's just say that Alfred was unconventional and did things that were very unusual. Now, once he did reunite with Sarah, his first wife, and his children, including Yda, Alfred had bounced around, by the way. He was in Cincinnati, he was in Montana, he was in other places in the Midwestern United States. But once they got back together, the family then wound up in Chihuahua, a northern state of Mexico. We don't know why Addis went down there. Maybe his pro-slavery sentiments. There were a lot of Confederates who had gone down to Mexico. There were rumors that the Confederates were trying to get the Mexicans to join them during the Civil War, which was a few years before. There could be a lot of reasons, or it could be just commercial, practical reasons. He wanted to try to do his photography work down there, for example. But Addis wound up writing to a newspaper in Texas, and that wound up being reprinted in Addis's hometown. So we know in 1870, when this article came out, that he was down in Mexico. And that's going to be important for his daughter and her future career. And being the migrating person that he was, Alfred packed up his family from Mexico and wound up coming to Los Angeles. They arrived here in 1873. During that time, the city was undergoing its first major period of growth. The population was rising, the economy was growing, and Addis may have been aware of that and thought he could come out and try and make his living as a photographer here in the Angel City. So here are a couple of articles where he's taken photographs in Cerro Gordo, which is a mining town way up in Inyo County in Eastern California, Anaheim, and he's displaying them at his photography business, trying to get people to buy his products or take advantage of his services. In the meantime, his daughter, who was about 15, 16 years old when they came to Los Angeles, very quickly made her name. The reason why I even came across Yda was about 20 years ago. I was doing some research on crime in early Los Angeles, and I had found a poem by a young woman named Ina Coolbrith, who wound up becoming quite well known in California around the same time that Yda was. And then I happened to see some poems of Yda's, doing some further research in that. About 7 or 8 years ago, I bought a photograph of a young child named Minnie Storke, and her father wound up marrying Yda later. So that's where I first got my attention drawn toward Yda Addis, and that eventually led to today's presentation. Here are a few samples of some of the poems. Again, this is a teenager in a little frontier town, but these poems were highly regarded, published mainly in the Los Angeles Evening Express, one of the 3 daily newspapers in town. And occasionally you'd see little articles like the one here on the top left, congratulating her on her beautiful work. And so they're kind of fun to read, to get a little bit of a flavor of how people would have done their poetry back in the 1870s period, at least a young teenage girl on the frontier. She wound up becoming a member of the first graduating class of Los Angeles High School, the first high school in our region. That was in 1875. You can see her name in the top left here with the other graduates in town, including Henry L. Melveny, whose father wound up becoming the founder of one of the big law firms in Los Angeles. Melveny and Myers is a name some of us might know from our LA area here. As soon as she graduated, she went and got her first grade teaching certificate, and that would be done through the State Normal School in San Jose, which is now San Jose State University. And she got a job quickly in Tustin, which was a new town in what later became Orange County. She was in that area for a couple of years, and then she wound up going back to Los Angeles and being assigned to a school just a little bit north and west of the plaza. So that was her profession for about 6-7 years, was school teacher. Her renown for her literary exploits continued to grow. She was reading poems at events. The Good Templars was a temperance organization. They were anti-alcohol. She was a member of the local lodge, and she would read poems at some of their events. There was a club, literary club in Los Angeles, which just shows that this little city is starting to have some of the amenities of the bigger cities out there. And she would read poems and stories for that as well. There was a Los Angeles Lyceum, another one of these literary organizations. While she was still in high school, she brought out a small monthly literary magazine called the Los Angeles Independent, which you can see a reference to here. And she was editor. This is a girl of about 17, 18 years old who was launching this. So pretty remarkable what she was able to do at a young age. And again, this is just on the bottom right here, another reference to that Good Templars temperance organization and her involvement in that. But over time, the family again starts to disintegrate. And so her father, Alfred, had been practicing photography in Santa Ana. He left for Tucson in 1879. The next year, here on the bottom left is the census record for 1880. He's in Silver City, New Mexico, which, as you can imagine, was a mining town. And then he winds up down in Mexico again while he leaves his wife and family behind. This is a reference to Sarah Addis and Yda's brother, whose name was Judge. They're in Santa Ana while Alfred is out gallivanting through the Southwest. So interesting times for a very interesting family. Yda, in the meantime, decided after a while that she didn't want to teach anymore, that she probably was looking to do more of the real work she wanted to do, which is literary. So she wound up going to Mexico, probably about 1882 or 83, joining her father down there. And she wrote letters back to the Los Angeles newspapers periodically, talking about what she encountered down there, the fast vanishing civilization of people down there. I'm assuming that means probably the native peoples in many cases, because she had a very avid interest in what the native Indians were doing of northern Mexico. She spent time in Mexico City and other communities. In the meantime, she was probably living with her father for a while, and then she wrote to the Times in 1886 that Alfred, a former citizen of Los Angeles, was traveling to try to get to Arkansas where the hot springs were. That would be for health reasons, but he got to El Paso, the border town in Texas, and died there. So she was keeping in contact with her former hometown here of Los Angeles. Now, what had happened before she went back to Mexico, evidently, around 1883 or 84, is as a struggling writer with her mother and presumably her brother, she was in financial distress. And she met a very wealthy and powerful figure, John G. Downey, who was from Ireland. He had come to California during the gold rush. He became a very powerful figure in Los Angeles, first a druggist, but later a politician and a landowner, was governor of California briefly during the Civil War years, and also founder of the town of Downey, because his wife, Maria Guirado, was from a family that owned a rancho called Santa Gertrudis that was on both sides of the San Gabriel River. So he was an older man by this point when he met this young, fascinating woman, Yda Addis. Now, Downey, as I said, was married to Maria Guirado, by all accounts, a very happy marriage. They had just come back from a wedding of his nephew in San Francisco. They were on a train that had been stopped at Tehachapi Pass. It was winter. There had been an inadvertent problem with linking up the cars, and several of them broke loose and went down a very steep grade. Several of the cars derailed, and there was a horrific accident that turned into a fire. John Downey was able to be pulled out. He was badly bruised and survived, but his wife was trapped in the wreckage and died, was burned to death. And he wound up in convalescence for a few years. My personal view is he had PTSD from that. That probably affected his mental state. And I'm bringing that up because the mental state of people is going to be pretty important for what we're talking about this afternoon. So Downey, when he came back to Los Angeles, met Yda. They were 28 years apart in age, something like that. He was, again, rich and powerful. She was beautiful and talented, and they seemed to have had a mutual attraction to each other. What that meant in terms of whether they were going to be married or not is an interesting question, because she said later on that he had proposed marriage, he had made a pledge to her, and he would later say that that was not the case at all, and that she had made all that up. So there was mystery involved. Now, Downey had two sisters, and they were very protective of him. He also had a nephew, one of his sister's sons, who was managing his business affairs. So it was rumored that he was spirited away, as you can see from this headline, taken by his relatives from Los Angeles to San Francisco for the express purpose of keeping him away from young Yda, who perhaps was being seen as a gold digger by this family that wanted to keep Downey away from her. So there were lots of articles, and I won't go through much detail with this, but the mystery of trying to find him, a fruitless search. You can imagine the paparazzi stalking the streets of San Francisco, trying to find the ex-governor. He is found at his sister's house, inaccessible to reporters. They try to interview him. It just sounds like what you would see with celebrities today. And it gets to be very convoluted, all the stories that come out. And what Yda starts to say are things like, well, Mr. Downey liked to drink, and so he promised me that he would stop drinking if we got married. And of course, that would agitate the family members. They didn't like to hear that kind of thing, whether it was true or not. There were also rumors that, well, maybe Mrs. Downey was not killed in the Tehachapi Holocaust of January 1883. That was rumors being printed in San Francisco newspapers, and the Los Angeles papers were outraged by this treatment of their favorite son down here. So it got to be kind of a weird situation. But Yda, as we'll talk about later, had a habit of writing very, very long letters of explanation about why things were the way she said they were. And because she was such a good writer, but also as a fiction writer on occasion, she could also have a pretty vivid imagination. This becomes an interesting dynamic of this. How much of what she was writing is true as opposed to fictional? And that goes the other way as well when it comes to the media. So just to give you one example, and I'm not going to read through any of this in any detail at all, but this is just part of a long two-column, two-page article that she wrote for the newspapers to explain why her story was true, that the family schemed to prevent their marriage that he had promised to her, that she was in fear for her life, which is another recurring theme in her stories over the years, was the danger that she was in by powerful people who were out to get her. So was there an element of paranoia to this or not? Evidence of an extensive conspiracy. She also cited a gentleman named Horace Bell, who had come to California in the 1850s to Los Angeles. He belonged to paramilitary and militia groups. He had a lot of gunfights. He had a paper called The Porcupine, which tells you all you need to know about how that paper operated. He was quite a character, and he wrote books that were very widely read at one point, and those books really should be treated with, well, instead of grains of salt, you probably need shakers of salt in terms of whether he was telling the truth or not. He was good at telling stories, as Yda was, and so it's a little interesting to kind of ponder how much of what she was trying to explain was true. But she was trying to get supporters to provide her some data or information or whatever recollections to help back up her story. So lots of these articles came out during the 1887 to 1888 period. And of course, the media loves this kind of stuff because they sell papers, obviously, when these great stories happen. Eventually, there were rumors that Yda was going to file a breach of promise lawsuit asking for $500,000. When she was asked about this, she would say, First she would say, no, I'm not going to do that at all. Then she said, well, I'm being told by my friends I probably should, if for no other reason than to get John Downey out of the clutches of his family and into the public so he can be released from being controlled. It's really interesting how she kind of phrased this sort of thing. That suit never really got anywhere. And eventually what happened is that Downey, now whether this was in conjunction with his family or attorneys or friends, finally gave interviews where he said, I'm here back in Los Angeles. By the way, he had gone to Europe. He had done a lot of traveling after his wife's death to try to get over what had happened, and then to San Francisco with his family for a period of time. So I'm coming back to manage my affairs. He was asked, how about that Yda Addis affair? Is there any truth in her statement? All a pack of lies. So far as our relations are concerned, I never was in love with the woman. In fact, I'm led to believe that the whole scheme was put up by blackmailing lawyers in this city. So who knows? There were lots of people who said they saw the two of them riding around in horse-drawn vehicles and visiting each other. There were stories about how Downey wanted to give money to Yda and her mother because they were living in poverty. She claimed that maybe he did offer money, but she always returned it, never decided to take any of that. Very shortly after this interview in 1888, Downey wound up marrying Rosa Kelly, who was said to be a housekeeper. Again, another much younger woman, and the matter seemed to have died from there. But notice at the end of this article I'm pointing to here, we do not dare to give any opinion, but our sympathies are decidedly with Miss Yda Addis, who has genius much more worthy of adulation than any female writer in the country, outside of 2 or 3 of the most prominent. This is a Los Angeles paper, so they were still very proud of her. As we go through later on, we'll find out that her reputation was not going to be quite as high. After the Downey affair, Yda wound up drifting back down to Mexico. And there could be a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, all the attention. She may have felt that she was being threatened by people associated with Downey and had to leave town, knowing the way that she wrote about things. But she did frequently communicate, by frequently several times. She would write letters from Chihuahua, from Querétaro, from Mexico City about what she was experiencing and seeing down in that area. And this is, again, the late 1880s, 1888, 89, that period of time. She published occasionally. A Maiden of Chihuahua appeared in the San Francisco Argonaut, which is a literary magazine. She was the first person to bring out some of the legends of Mexico. Famous one, La Llorona, which was kind of a spiritual tale. She brought that out during that time as well. So she was starting to make a name for herself as somebody who had experience going back to her childhood, but also in later years in areas of Mexico. And her biggest achievement appeared to have been an article she did about iridescent pottery of peoples in a very remote area of Mexico. And she submitted it to one of the most famous magazines in the United States called Harper's Monthly. There was also Harper's Weekly. Harper's at the time was edited by Charles Dudley Warner. Nobody knows his name today, but he was quite well known as a journalist. He was obviously editor of this publication, and he agreed to publish her article. But what apparently happened is he sent somebody down to verify what she claimed was true, a Dr. Prime, and then decided to publish the article apparently under his own name. And he probably thought, this is a young woman, she's not going to be able to challenge me. I'm Charles Dudley Warner, I'm a prominent figure and all that. I don't think he expected her to fight back the way that she did, and she certainly did. She wrote long letters, long articles, going into great detail, which apparently it looks to be completely accurate as far as her version of things, that she had come up with this research, written this article, and it was basically stolen from her. This is 1889, 1890. So we're seeing a woman who is perfectly willing to fight back if she believes that she's been wronged. And in cases like this, it appears that she indeed was. There's a saying among some people in the history business, don't fall in love with your subject. That could be just a topic where you become so engrossed in it that you don't have your relative independent thinking about it. In this case, it's an actual person. Yda came back to Southern California in 1889, was hired to write a history of Central California, meaning Santa Barbara, Ventura, San Luis Obispo area, for a Chicago publishing company called Lewis. And that was kind of an amazing thing in itself, that a woman was hired to do this kind of work. And while she was doing that, she met a gentleman down here in the bottom right named Charles Albert Storke. And he was being interviewed for the book. He had a lengthy biography in there. In fact, you would pay for your biography. So she was probably interviewing him because he had agreed he wanted to be part of that, get his name out there, get his photo in a book. These were often called mug books, by the way. Storke had an interesting background himself. He was from a small area, small town in New York, born in the late 1840s. His father died when he was a child. His mother taught school and raised her kids. And at age 16, Storke and a couple of friends of his, then living in Wisconsin, went and volunteered to join the Union Army. So he is basically a sophomore or a junior in high school by our standards, and he is now in the Union Army participating in battles. He was captured just a few months after joining in a major battle with the Confederates, and he was taken to several of the most notorious prisoner of war camps during the Civil War, the most egregious one being Andersonville, which you may have heard of. And if you haven't, look it up. It's a pretty sad story what happened to these Union soldiers who were kept there. He managed to survive. He was one of the few people who had been captured in his regiment who was able to emerge from this. This is the 1860 census, by the way, where he was living with his mother and one of his brothers. But he was still in his teens when he was released from the prisoner of war camp. He went to a parole camp in Maryland and then was freed and allowed to go back home, even though the war wasn't finished yet. He went to Michigan, enrolled in a college there, and then was in the first graduating class of Cornell University in upstate New York, not far from where he was born. He had an avid interest in history. He won honors in his education there at Cornell, and then taught school in Brooklyn, New York, which was an independent city back then, and later became part of the city of New York. So he was a teacher as well, and he was lured to California, I'm not sure exactly how, to become a teacher for a prominent rancher in the Santa Barbara area named Thomas More. And as often happens, the teacher fell in love with the pupil. And so Martha, who was Thomas More's daughter, married Charles Storke in September 1873. Through Martha's mother, she was descended from the Ortega family, one of the first families to come to California during the Spanish period. One of her ancestors was in the Portola expedition, the first land-based exploration of Spanish individuals in California. Now, again, I kind of found out about the Storkes through this photograph that I acquired about 7 or 8 years ago of their daughter, their oldest child, whose name was Manita. And so that kind of led me into the Storke side. The reason why this photo was taken in Los Angeles is because Charles had been grub-staked, basically given money by his father-in-law, Thomas More, to open a newspaper called the Los Angeles Daily Herald. It debuted in October 1873, just a month after Charles married Martha More. And it was the third daily newspaper to start in the city of LA during that growth period that was going on at the time. Interestingly, in that first article, and I'm not sure Storke would have written this, but it talks about a young lady entering the office to learn typesetting, proofreading, and journalism. That she was somebody who preferred to be occupied rather than idleness, social shams, and servile dependence. But then the article goes on to talk about what women should be doing. Should they be doing this kind of thing or not? What's their true mission in life? And I wondered, once I saw this, whether or not he was talking about Yda, because she was in LA, she had just moved there herself, and who knows? It may not be her at all, but it certainly sounds like her. Now, Storke didn't stay in the newspaper business very long. He was not making money at it, and he basically lost the newspaper, and it was taken over by a group, including FPF Temple, who was William Worpen's son-in-law from the homestead. But Storke bounced back on his feet, went and got his he had a law degree already, went and got his admission to the bar and opened up a legal practice back in Santa Barbara. He later went on to politics. He served in the state legislature in 2 or 3 different periods of time in the 1880s. This is just a reference to one of his terms in the legislature where he dropped a bombshell against his Democratic colleagues in the legislature. It's not worth talking about, but it's just a reference to his political career. So he was a prominent guy, like Downey was in Los Angeles, Storke was in Santa Barbara. And what happens is Yda marries Storke. They had their interview for this book she was writing, and the notable wedding took place. Storke is one of our best known and most respected citizens, a leading position at the bar, a politician of great prominence. Yda is one of the literary celebrities of the coast. She stands preeminently the best in California as a short story writer. So it looks like the ideal marriage. You got a powerful gentleman, you've got a talented woman. What could go wrong? Well, this newspaper article, which is a quote from the Redlands Citrograph, Redlands being out by San Bernardino, might give us a hint. They say, we understand that they're going to live in Santa Barbara, but we're willing to wager a cookie, misspelled, I guess, that Mrs. Ida can no more be kept quiet at home than could Miss Ida. That doesn't sound good. And it didn't take long. Within 9 months, this marriage completely collapsed. And if you saw the movie War of the Roses, came out some years ago, this might be a 1890s version of that. And there were items thrown and accusations made of all kinds. I won't go into a lot of detail with this, although it'd be kind of fun to do that. But basically, both of them were very public about what they were going to say to the press and to the public about what was going on here. So Ida has statements that she's going to make to the press talking about her husband, that he had weird sexual proclivities, that he wouldn't bathe for periods of time, he wouldn't change his clothes. He's asserting, on the other hand, that she is insane in a variety of ways, that she had an insane antipathy to his son, Thomas, who was 14 years old, that she's tried to commit suicide several times. She says, well, sure, if you're going to say I'm insane, that is it not your duty to provide proper asylum and maintenance to me instead of turning me out of doors and so forth and so on. He's claiming that she needs a guardian appointed by the court to take care of her. It really becomes a fascinating mess. And it's a long one. So there is an initial suit for divorce. It goes on in 1891, 92, and it becomes a situation where, again, there's a lot of discussion about who's doing what to each other, completing claims of insanity, again, as I referred to before. But a lot of this, as you look at these headlines, is not about Charles Storke. It's Yda Addis Storke. Now, this is about her statement, but Yda Addis's trouble. So even though her husband's talking here about how she's insane, it's her trouble that's going on. So again, it's clearly a point of view about gender going on here that is pretty obvious.
We have a question.
Absolutely.
We have Denise asking, how old was Ida when she married?
She was 33 and Charles was 43. So it wasn't like Downey where there was basically a father-daughter type of age difference. It was about 10 years.
Okay, and I just wanted to point out, Sunny, I see you raising your hand. I'm not quite sure for what, but if you have another question, please let me know.
All right. So there are several court rulings in this. And basically what Ida wants is what most women would want. They want their court costs covered and they want alimony. And so what she was requesting was $50 per month. Now that was a fairly substantial amount of money for the time. It wasn't a lot of money though. But Charles Storke clearly was in no mood whatsoever to placate her in any way. And he was going to fight her tooth and nail on this. So even though there were court rulings several times that granted her either alimony or paying her attorney fees, even as there are future filings, and there are those, he is going to fight everything as much as possible. He's a lawyer, he is politically connected, and so forth. And so it's putting the burden on her to be able to continue the fight. And that was probably, obviously, a strategy that Charles Storke had, is to see if she can tough it out. And she was a pretty determined person. We've gotten some inklings of that already, and we'll see more of it. But it wound up becoming another issue in terms of her purported health. So there was talk about here on the right here, she was very ill during her marriage. Her husband used violent epithets towards her and kind of pushed her around and what have you. But he said also that there were times when she was trying to interfere in his affairs or do things that would be embarrassing to him. So for example, on the top of this article here, there was apparently an effort to lynch a Latino man who had been accused of a crime. And she was determined to go out and either try to prevent the lynching or at least write about it. And he didn't want her to go out and do that. It would embarrass him, that sort of thing. Another time he had a court case and she didn't like what his associate lawyer was trying to do. And she wanted him to basically fire the guy. And he wouldn't do it. And so she threatened to go out publicly and try and make something happen. He accused her of trying to overdose on morphine, as referred to in this article. He said she set her clothes on fire as an attempt to kill herself. Now, obviously, a lot of this is happening in a home where we don't have a lot of witness testimony. And if there is, it could be biased one way or another. But it just got to be really, really cruel in terms of how they were accusing each other, but also very fascinating in the depths and details to which these two were going to go to fight with their case here.
We have a couple more questions.
Sure.
Forgive me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, but Parhelion asks, why did Storke say Yda was crazy?
He said he was insane, and he tried to give the examples, a couple I referred to, the fact that she tried to commit suicide. So at least 2 times. He talked about morphine. He talked about her trying to set her clothes on fire. He talked about her irrational behavior, fits of anger, fits of anxiety. Others had talked about that over time. If you look at some of the newspaper articles and other things, not necessarily with this case even, but other examples, you could see that. Some of that came out in the Downey incident. But there were others who said she was not insane. She might be excitable. She might have, be quick to anger, which a lot of us are. So it's one of those things where, for a woman, especially at this time, where there are expectations of how you behave in proper Victorian society, and who knows what Storke's demands were. He might have thought he was going to turn her into a pliable housewife, that sort of thing. So I think that's part of the dynamic of this is how do you determine whether somebody is insane or not? And just along those lines, when it got to this first stage of the divorce proceedings, he brought in doctors to talk about her purported insanity. And so a lot of that was brought out in the court proceedings there. She, of course, would counter by saying that he was insane and that she was trying to battle with him. By the way, on the bottom right here is a fascinating little cartoon from a Santa Barbara newspaper, 2 storks who are chained together as they're battling in the divorce case.
What happened to Martha Moore, Charles's first wife?
I should have mentioned that. Yes. What happened was they were married in 1873. They had a few children, and they divorced not long before he married Yda. And it was apparently a bitter divorce as well. And it is an important point to bring up because it could obviously bear on Storke's own personality. Now, like I said earlier, Downey probably had PTSD. I can't imagine he wouldn't, from being imprisoned as a teenager in these horrible Confederate prisoner of war camps. Storke, Downey was in the train accident. Storke is in the prison camps. So I'm wondering if he too had something along the lines of Downey, where something happened to them that was very traumatic and it could affect their behavior. Again, that's pure speculation, but people did plenty of that with Yda too. What you don't hear as much in the media coverage is about the mental state of the gentleman involved. Okay, so again, it just goes on, and there are, again, frequent orders of the court that Charles has to provide attorney's fees, provide ways for her to defray her expenses because he's got some means. She's not as well off as he is, but he is going to fight every one of these and try not to pay any of this stuff. Now, a strange thing happens during the latter part of this first divorce case in 1892. It comes out, and again, this could be Storke working with operatives to do this because she apparently was being followed at points during this by strange figures, but it was revealed in the press that when she was in Mexico, she had an affair with a newspaper editor that she worked for in Mexico City. And that got back to his wife in Chicago, and she filed for divorce, and she brought Yda's name into it. Well, shortly after that comes out, Yda has an explanation for this. It is that she is the victim of one of the strangest acts of mistaken identity on record. What she says is that, yes, she is down in Mexico, but it wasn't her who did this. It was a half-sister she didn't know about named Maud Wallace Addis, which I'm pointing to here in the middle. And she told this lengthy story, and she said she had letters that would demonstrate, here's an example on the right here, documents in her possession, that a letter written by Maud to a gentleman in Chihuahua, and she talks about her identity, that she was leading a life of shame in Chicago and fell in with gentlemen who didn't treat her well, and she wound up in Mexico and all of that. It sounds fictional, and a lot of people at the time thought that this was all a made-up story, and it really sounds like that in many ways, except that there was a Maud Wallace Addis. Earlier I mentioned that Yda's father, Alfred, had left Yda's mother, married a woman in Cincinnati. Her name was Wallace, and they had a daughter in the late 1860s. This is the 1880 census in Des Moines, Iowa. At that point, Ellen had secured her divorce from Alfred Addis and married another man, and their daughter's living with them. In 1885, the young woman, Maud A. Yeaton, so the A would be, I think, Addis, is living in Des Moines in 1885. Now, Alfred Addis dies in 1886, and then the events that Yda is talking about occur not long afterwards. I couldn't find any evidence that Maud Addis ever was down in Mexico. She died on the East Coast in 1893 when she was 26 years old. So it's possible that Yda used Maud as a way to try to explain her own behavior down in Mexico and to try to deflect criticism of her while she's battling in her divorce suit with her husband back in Santa Barbara. Crazy stuff. You almost can't make this kind of thing up, but a lot of it is factual. Some of it is obviously interwoven with some fiction as well. Now, what's happening during this time also, just to kind of give a little break in the court stuff here, is that Yda's reputation, which was quite high in the 1870s, 80s, and into the early 90s, is going to start to suffer. And how much of this, again, is her own behavior, how much of it is Charles's, how much of it is the media's, or all three's, that's up for debate. But she, even during her first divorce, the very first proceedings, the Friday Morning Club, a very powerful women's club in Los Angeles, invites her to come down as the noted writer on the women of old Mexico and to give a talk. She was basically filling in, by the way, for Jessie Benton Fremont, one of the most well-known women in the United States. Her husband was a presidential candidate, a explorer hero, war hero, that sort of thing. She's at lunch parties. In 1893, she's still publishing occasionally articles in magazines. But by the time the 1890s comes to an end, she is basically seen as a ruined woman. So the idea of what happens to a woman during these kinds of events, especially with intense media coverage, is not an uncommon story, unfortunately. All right, here we go again. So I'm going to kind of run through this fairly quickly, but just more of the battling between Yda and her husband about the alimony, about the court fees. There is finally a decision in the divorce case where he had basically turned the tables on her. She initially filed for divorce. As you can see here, it's Yda versus Charles. Later, it's Charles versus Yda. And despite that, the battles continue. And so even though he's filing the divorce case here in the bottom, the judge rules that the plaintiff is ordered to pay her alimony and attorney's fees, but Charles is not going to do that, and it just keeps on going. The Supreme Court gets involved. It just gets to be pretty amazing. There was also insolvency that Storke brought into this. So again, this is another tactic that people will use, is to say, well, I'm bankrupt, I can't pay that amount of money, and see if they can get that basically quashed through insolvency. Another interesting little thing that popped up during this is an actress who called herself Yda Addis. And she married a man who called himself Lord Sholto Douglas. It's kind of a quirky, bizarre little thing, but it just shows how popular culture can take something and morph it into something quite different. So whether it's Maud Wallace Addis and her supposed trip to Mexico and her half-sister being there at the same time, or whether it's somebody taking Yda's name as an actress, it's just kind of a weird manifestation of what can happen during those days. All right, court drama rolls on. There's just more Supreme Court rulings, more things about Charles has got to provide money to Yda. It's just not going to happen. And you wonder how much has preyed on her already perhaps fragile mental state as this is going on, because it's clearly a strategy of his to grind her down through court hearings. And it just continues. It's just kind of stunning how lengthy this is drawn out during that time. Another manifestation of that, though, becomes perhaps because Yda was frustrated that she couldn't secure an ultimate victory against her husband, a small amount of money as it really was, she tried to get to him through his son. Basically what happened in 1898 is she accused a 21-year-old Thomas of stealing a remittance of $1, a $1 money order that she had gotten from a San Francisco newspaper for a correspondence that she published. And he says, no, it was addressed wrongly. You can see here in the bottom where I'm pointing. It was addressed to a Y.A. Storke. I didn't know who that was. Pardon me, to another initial, I guess it's T.M. Storke. Didn't know who that was, even though that sounds like his name. And so I returned it to the post office, and it sounded kind of sketchy, maybe on both sides of this. But he turned around and charged her with perjury. So she had him arrested for petty larceny. He turns around and has her arrested for perjury. She winds up dropping the suit against him, and her perjury case was eventually dropped as well. But during this, she has to go under medical care. And again, it's just more discussion about her mental state and what was going on. It was just A really interesting legal mess going on here. And Yda was not immune from filing lawsuits against other people as well. So she had a problem with a newspaper that wouldn't, she said, compensate her for something she had written to them. So she filed a lawsuit in 1896 against them. I don't know what happened to that one. One of her bosom friends, when she had gone to Mexico, she left some personal goods with that person and said she didn't get them back, so she was suing for the return. But the defendant was the victor in that case. So again, there may be some things going on where she just was starting to get paranoid. She couldn't trust people, and she started to even maybe turn on some of her friends in terms of filing lawsuits. All interesting stuff in terms of what her mental state may have been. And guys, if we hadn't had enough, there's another really amazing part of this as well. There had been a couple of murders that took place in Santa Barbara in the middle to late 1890s. A mother and daughter were found brutally murdered. And Yda evidently was involved in this to the extent where there were some letters that were written that seemed to indict a couple of people for their roles in this. And the letters evidently were written by Yda. Why she would have done this is an interesting question. There had been some discussion that maybe she was on the hunt to try to solve this murder and that she was having trouble doing that. So she maybe thought she could find a way to implicate some people and maybe get some publicity out of it. It's interesting to ponder some of that as you read through this material. But what happened was she was indicted on a charge of libel for this because of what she had been saying about these two people that she implicated as being involved in these murders. Now, to further complicate this, the district attorney of Santa Barbara County was none other than her former husband, Charles Albert Storke. So another question is, was she being targeted because her husband was trying to tighten the screws on her as well? Poison pen letters are what these are called, where you write letters and you basically are implicating other people in some kind of immoral, unethical, illegal behavior and whatever. She was arrested for this in early 1899. The newspapers are starting to talk about her in different ways now. There's not as much praise for her past as a writer, so much as concern about what she is doing in this little provincial city on the coast. And it certainly was fodder for a lot of rumor and innuendo. You can see in this article here, they talk about the fact that the story which she's been telling is weird enough to belong in that dim realm between sanity and insanity in which Edgar Allan Poe so loved to linger. There are dead men walking the earth, shadows, bend and listen, plot on plot, horror on horror. Public officials are charged with things, people are implicated, and so on. It got to be pretty dramatic. And so she wound up giving an interview in jail to the newspaper saying that none of this was true whatsoever, but she does talk about the fact that there are people who would like to successfully remove me from the path of certain parties to whom I am a serious obstacle. Presumably that would be her husband and maybe other people. She was indicted for this, and a trial took place towards the middle part of 1899, June and into July. There were photographs of her appearing in the papers. There was talk about her, she's now 45, she's in middle age, she's not quite the striking figure that she once had been. She also tried to make a couple of different claims. One is that an old friend of hers had actually come to the trial and said that Mrs. Storke had asked her to copy anonymous letters. So there seemed to be some implication that there was an effort from Yda to, if not do this herself, to have others do it for her. She also testified in her own defense. And in many criminal cases, defense attorneys do not want their clients to testify. But in this case, they seem to think it was important to do so. A handwriting expert was brought in and went to great lengths, and he was interviewed or interrogated in court, questioned by attorneys for lengthy periods of time about the handwriting. This is an excerpt from the newspaper where they tried to show that this is her admitted handwriting. This is an example from the letter, and they have to be the same because when you look at the B's, they look very similar. You can make your own judgment about that. To me, they don't look totally the same. There may be some similarities there. But this appears to be the basis on which she was convicted, was this one expert who was questioned for many, many hours by both sides in this case. And that's basically how she seems to have been convicted of the crime of libel in this. But we can't leave this case without bringing up another sensation, which is that one of the people who was brought in to testify in this libel case was a former attorney of hers from the Storke divorce case, a man named Grant Jackson. Now, back in 1896, Storke, who was so determined to do anything he could vindictively against his wife, went after Jackson and tried to get him disbarred because of his supposed behavior representing Yda during the divorce case. That did not happen. Jackson was not disbarred, but Storke sure tried. Charles did. But during the libel trial, it was decided by Yda and her defense team to claim that it was Jackson who wrote the letters involving this murder that were implicating the people. It was not Yda who did that. It was Jackson. And this is him here on the left. So it took a very interesting turn. We'll bring him back in just a moment. Okay, so Yda is found guilty by a Santa Barbara County jury in a libel case. She was given a 1-year sentence in jail. The judge said to her, "I wish I could give you more." He felt that she had done something that was so horrendous that it should have even stiffer sentence than was given. And again, this is a jury trial, but what kind of influence the media had, what kind of influence Charles Storke had as a district attorney, the kinds of witnesses being brought in, these are all very interesting legal questions. All right, Yda is sentenced to her year in county jail, and that evening, or actually the early morning of the next day, she goes to Jackson's house. She's carrying a variety of things in a bag with her. She has chloroform, she has a towel, she has some other stuff. She enters through a window, and she is starting to put a cloth on his face, and he feels a little tickle, and he turns over thinking it was just something in the room, and then she does it again, and he feels it again, and he jumps up, and there she is. He pulls out a gun, and there's a struggle, and the gun goes off. And so Yda, who is sentenced to jail and then is arrested within 24 hours for what was a claim of attempted murder against her former attorney, is now in more trouble. And she gets arraigned for the attempted murder of Grant Jackson. And there's some shenanigans in the court. There's some mistakes made in terms of arraignment that wasn't done properly. I won't go into detail about it, but it winds up becoming a pretty amazing thing. She also claims, by the way, that she was married to Grant Jackson by contract. In other words, not done in church, not done before a judge, but kind of a common law type of thing. Why she made this claim is interesting, because she's also claiming that he wrote those poison pen letters. It gets to be kind of a wacky situation. But even the press in Santa Barbara is starting to think that maybe she was the one who killed the Richardson mother and daughter. Why she would have done that, who knows? But it's almost like rumor was so rife in that town that the media started to buy into a lot of this stuff. And it got to the point where even her attire was being questioned, that she was wearing a gray blanket with a low collar and a belt, and she was looking disheveled, and not necessarily like you see in this image, but it really got to be interesting to see how she was being portrayed at the end of this.
We have a
It was
question.
also, go ahead, yes.
Parahelian asks, was the jury all men?
There was nothing that I could find that would indicate that. No names of jury members, nothing of that type. But at that time, women were not permitted to be on juries. So that would answer your question, basically, but not in terms of who the jurors were. Yeah, women were not on juries. Interestingly, when I did one of these discussions last year on a woman in LA named Lastenia Barda, who was accused of killing her lover on a breach of promise, in the middle of the day, in broad daylight, she had obviously an all-male jury, male judge, male attorneys, and a lot of the observers in the court probably were male too. And she was acquitted of that. So it's not a guarantee that because you've got an all-male jury that a woman can't get justice. But I think part of what we're talking about here is not just about that. It's about who's the DA, what kind of pull that person has, that sort of thing. Again, there's no way to know because we can't read the minds of jurors we don't know about, but it's interesting to think about some of the effects that could happen with this. But again, some of this media attention gets to a point where this article comes out that Yda was under close surveillance because while she's in jail, she's been allowed to send and receive letters. Young girls have been accused of intimacy with men of questionable character, while heads of families have also received pretenses of warnings. It was so bad that people thought that that must have been her doing that, even though it's quite plausible that anybody could write a poison pen letter or maybe be influenced by stories they read in the media about those kinds of things. But this is kind of where she was at. Now, initially, the Supreme Court of California decided to affirm the verdict at the Santa Barbara Superior Court for her criminal libel conviction. But Yda goes ahead and she does her own independent petition shortly afterwards. This is in, I think, March 1900 when she does this. And this is an LA Times article, I believe, and they say that the incident illustrates again the remarkable ability that underlies the defendant's character, that she is willing to take this on herself, write up her own petition to have a rehearing, that it actually is heard by the Supreme Court of California, and they do rule that she should have a retrial. Now, she's already served 10 months of her sentence. She got out for good behavior early, right before this. So even though she got out of jail, just as this is happening, the Supreme Court goes ahead and rules that she should have a new trial. That never happened. So it's kind of a Pyrrhic victory. In other words, it's a victory that she finally wins something, but what was the cost to her health? What was the cost to her financially? What did it mean for her in general? And so, yes, she got freed. Yes, she was able to get the Supreme Court to issue a rehearing ruling, but what was the ultimate cost for her? And by the way, guys, Storke continued to fight all the way to the end. This is in 1899, while she's waiting for her criminal libel trial. He was cited to appear by the Superior Court asking why he should not be held for contempt for not paying that alimony that he was supposed to give her a long time ago. This guy just would not give up. So in terms of character, faults and that sort of thing, I don't think there's any question that multiple people had their different issues going on here. A couple of odds and ends to wrap up with here. When she was involved in this libel trial, there was a gentleman named Frank Gutierrez who was evidently accused of being involved with these and even of writing some of these poison pen letters. So during that trial period, this comes out in a Santa Barbara paper. The villain still pursues our worthy fellow men, Gutierrez. I can't imagine that most Latinos felt that they were considered worthy fellow men in Santa Barbara in those days, but they're basically saying the villain Yda Addis is at it again. She is trying to pin this on Frank Gutierrez. He was even concerned about his own safety during that period, according to local newspapers. And in 1901, April, after everything had pretty much wrapped up, he was gone for 4 days. And there was rumors that he was met with foul play. And guess who seemed to have been involved with this, according to some people in town, was Yda Addis Storke Jackson, according to her. This is a fascinating article. Again, you can find this on newspapers.com if you have a subscription, or you can ask me, you can send me an email. I'll have that at the end, and I'll be happy to send it to you. An amazing article from a San Francisco newspaper. I believe it's the Examiner, which is William Randolph Hearst owned. It was known for its yellow journalism, for sensationalizing things, as media often does. But Woman Who Terrorized the Whole Town, it goes into a long description here in kind of ladder form of her life, her activities. A lot of it is fictional. A lot of it is based in some reality. A lot of it happens to be truthful. But trying to sort that out as a reader back then would be interesting, to say the least, and maybe hard to sort out now. Let me go back there. Sorry about that. What basically happens is Yda vanishes. She just disappears. There are sources that suggest that she had been put into an insane asylum by Charles Storke and that she escaped. I found nothing about that. If somebody out there has found it, one of you listening and watching today, I'd love to hear about it. It's frequently cited in articles online and that sort of thing. I couldn't find that at all. But she does vanish. The question is what happens to her. Some sources say she died about 1902, because obviously that's not long after all this happens. There is a family tree on Ancestry.com that says she died in 1911 in a specific place in Chihuahua State, Mexico, which does seem very plausible because she had a brother. I mentioned him very early on, Judge, who had moved to Mexico long before he was down there. He died in 1908. And so it may be that she just lived quietly with her brother until he passed away. And the source on Ancestry doesn't indicate a record of death or anything else. It just has a date and a place. And so who knows? But it may be that she lived maybe a decade longer and went back to Chihuahua. She probably had some of the best aspects of her life, where she did most of her important work and had lived with her family on and off during the years. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up, and thank you for listening and watching. I do want to mention here we have some upcoming events of note. We have a paper preservation workshop coming up next Saturday, June 13th. Our Fiction and Book Club, which Isis is one of the moderators with, is on June 17th. Got a great presentation on ragtime, jazz, and swing, dance and music and societal issues and that sort of thing on the 21st. And finally, at the end of the month, a presentation about Black leaders of leisure in the American West. So it's a discussion about what was going on with the ability of African Americans to have leisure in Los Angeles and other places during that time. So look on our website, homesteadmuseum.org, for more information on those. You can certainly contact us and ask any further questions. As far as this presentation, please feel free to email me at this address, and I'll leave it up on the screen as we wrap up. So thank you again very much for being with us today.
Okay, guys, so now is a good chance to ask more questions if you have them. I do have one from Dolores already. She wants to know, how did you research this story and where did you find your newspaper articles? And I'm also going to put up a poll really quick so you guys can answer that question as well.
Sure thing. Yeah, as I had mentioned at the very beginning, I had come across Yda's name many years ago. So I had a couple little things that I had found probably 20 years ago. I think some of the poems and that sort of thing. When I bought the photograph of Charles Storke's daughter 7 or 8 years ago, I did a little bit of searching just to get an idea of the background for the description in our catalog. But the bulk of this has been in recent weeks, just pouring through Ancestry.com, newspapers.com. Those are pretty common sources to look for and to look at. But sometimes you just have to ask interesting questions and dig, like finding that German language newspaper reference to Yda's father's second marriage. That took a little bit of, I was trying to find it somewhere and it was really hard to do that. And I kind of just stumbled upon that one. So sometimes you just get lucky and find things.
Okay, so I'm going to end this poll then. The question was, do you think she had impartial justice? And we had 29% say yes, 38% say no, and 36, it just changed, 36% say not sure. And let's see, another question from Denise asks, did she get all this attention because she was a newspaper person?
Well, I think it's kind of multi-phase question. Initially, she got attention because she was a talented poet and writer and all of that. And she did some journalism too in terms of writing letters back to LA especially. So I would say up to 1890, that's what her renown was for her work. And again, for women at this time to even get a foothold in the world of journalism or literary pursuits, magazines, it was pretty difficult to do. After 1890, it becomes more about her as a person, her mental state, her appearance, what she may or may not have been doing. Was she a wicked woman who was creating all this havoc in Santa Barbara, that sort of thing. So I kind of see it in two phases that way.
All right, Nellie asks, how do you choose which incidents and stories you choose to cover?
With this particular event, that was particularly hard. It isn't like there was one case at one time that you could highlight. She had the Downey incident in the 1880s, 86, 87 period, and then she had Storke through the whole 90s. And there was so much to pour through. One of my concerns for today was they're going to overwhelm you guys with just too much stuff, too many newspaper articles, that sort of thing, because there is so much there. It just didn't end. And so that was part of the fascination with it. But I would say I probably had 250 or 300 different sources on a file that I had to winnow down just to the ones that I put on here. But yeah, there was no source, no endless, or no end to the source of material to go with. But yeah, it was trying to find the stories that would get most to the questions I was interested in, which is how are women being perceived in the media, being perceived in the courtroom, and how do the reputations change as a result of that?
All right, guys, I'm going to give you about 10 seconds for any final questions, and I want to thank you all for attending. And all right, Nellie, I hope that answered your question. If it didn't quite answer your question, feel free to reword it. I'm still looking at Facebook if you'd like. And Sunny, your question from earlier, I hope was answered correctly. If it was not fully answered, please let me know. And once again, at the end of this program, you should be receiving an email in a little bit that will have a survey on this program. It helps us a lot for you to fill it out and helps us improve and do things like this in the future. So we'd appreciate it greatly if you fill it out. Elizabeth says, great presentation, thank you. Parhelion asks, have you ever read one of her stories?
I have read parts of stories that have been in the newspapers. I haven't read anything that was in the Argonaut. I haven't seen the article that Warner kind of took from her from Harper's. So not the literary magazine stuff. It's basically been the newspapers.
All right, that looks like all the questions. Nellie, you can maybe rewind a little bit to be able to see the answer, but if not, I'm also typing out an answer to you that I will finish after this program ends. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.
All right, thank you guys. Appreciate it.